not believe I put this on Do Not Disturb yet. Okay, let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our soul, O good one. Last week we began talking about a disparity that we can experience sometimes when we go to church, and we notice that sometimes priests do all the prayers out loud, particularly what we call the Anaphra Prayers. In particular, for those of you who are Anaphra, what is that? Right before we hear, "Take, eat, this is my body," there's a nice long prayer there. And sometimes you hear that because the priest waits for the choir to stop singing, and sometimes the priest prays underneath the choir, sometimes the priest prays silently. We began talking about all of that, and the fact of the matter is that the trend has shifted more and more towards doing those prayers out loud, waiting for the choir to stop singing, and then the priest offering that prayer out loud. That has been the trend, and I have no interest in trying to buck the trend. As I said last week, I have served the liturgy that way for probably the last 10 years or so. That is the way that I have been serving. I know that the history of this parish is a little bit different, that Father Paul went to St. Tikhon's. I didn't go to St. Tikhon's, but I was trained at St. Tikhon's. And so I started off serving exactly the way Father Paul Suda used to serve, which was to do those prayers silently. And the question is not to figure out who's right or wrong. That's rarely is it a matter in liturgy of the right way or the wrong way. I know we tend to think in those terms sometimes, but really the question is what's going on there. And the question that I'm particularly interested in is asking two things. One, when we come into this space and when we experience the liturgy, we're experiencing the language of the kingdom. We're experiencing, therefore, the ethos and the logic of something that is not unrelated to this world, but is something that is greater than this world. And that language is giving us indicators of how we are to approach the divine presence. And so when we look at things like this, it's helpful to ask questions. What is that language? What is the nature of what we're doing? Secondly, as I said before, though, last week, that the offering of not just those prayers, but a whole number of prayers, some of which are completely, at this point in history, no one's saying to do the prayers out loud. For instance, at Vespers, the priest offers 7 prayers of light during the opening psalm. There is an interesting study that suggests that in the parish typicon of Constantinople, those prayers would have been connected to a number of litanies to a much longer service of Vespers than we're used to, and that later on were consolidated into this block where the priest did them quietly. Same thing at Matins. And no one's really saying, hey, those prayers need to be done out loud because we all need to hear everything in the church. So there's a sort of balance of some things should be done out loud, some things can continue to be done quietly, etc. But the real question is, why in the first place? Why did the church, for at least the last 1,500 years, universally pray in this particular way? That becomes an interesting question, and one of the things that I am dissatisfied with is the notion that this was a degradation of liturgy, that this was a degradation beginning in the 5th or 6th century, where the church just decided that clericalism would be the order of the day. We need to protect the liturgy from the people, those sorts of ideas. They're not worthy of hearing these prayers, therefore they should be done silently. I don't think that's why these prayers started that way at all. And I certainly agree with those who would feel that that was a betrayal of our Christian faith, a betrayal of our Christian liturgy. So we're in agreement there, but what I'm not in agreement with is that the church, sometimes the church adopts in one locale for a brief period of time, the church might adopt something that's a little bit off, and then they correct it by the grace of the Holy Spirit. But the idea that a practice would become absolutely universal for at least 1,500 years, strictly on a completely mistaken understanding of the relationship to the priests and the people and the words of the liturgy, I think is a dissatisfying answer. That's essentially the answer that the scholars of the liturgical revival of the 20th century came up with, Dom Gregory Dix, Robert Taft, and others. And I think that they're not looking, well, forgive me, they are much better, they are scholars, and they're working in the original sources, and I am not. But I'm a priest, and while I can have humility about I am not at their, nowhere near their class and level of being scholars, I have to ask the question, are you suggesting that all the saints of that entire era were simply delusional or simply overtaken by some kind of irascible rejection of the faithful and of the laity? And I just don't believe that that's true. So we're going to continue on this, but not because we're just doing an academic exercise, because I think by asking these questions, we begin to ask ourselves, why? Why are things the way they are in the church? What are we doing, and what is it asking of us? And that's what's going to lead us into the next element of the rule of prayer in relationship especially to the way the liturgy is. Let me start with this. In the ancient world, if you wanted to have an event and you wanted to make sure that a lot of people gathered and those people could see what was happening at that event and hear what was happening at the event, they knew exactly what to build. Anyone think of what you would build if you wanted an event where everyone could see and hear really clearly? The Greek-Roman world. Yep, Colosseum is a great example. And a Colosseum is a spectacular example also of an amphitheater. We've all heard of amphitheaters, right? And you can see pictures of amphitheaters, ancient Greek and Roman amphitheaters. And what characterizes the Colosseum or the amphitheater is that the action is down low, and there are tiers rising up, and the people are either standing or seated on those tiers looking down at the action, right? Heinz Field is a Colosseum. You want to make sure that everyone has a good seat. You want to make sure that everyone can see what was happening. Same thing about the acoustics of amphitheaters. In an amphitheater, the acoustics are designed geniusly. Even outdoor amphitheaters, they used the natural geography and the hills to make sure that whatever was spoken on the stage acoustically rose in the direction of the people so that they could hear everything. So the ancients understood what to build. If your primary focus was theater, or gladiatorial games, or races, or athletic contests, you build an amphitheater, you build a Colosseum, you build something where the people's visual and auditory perception is prioritized, right? They understood that. That is not the way they built churches, interestingly, ever until the modern era. Churches were never built as amphitheaters. Churches were never built as colosseums. Churches were built, in fact, with the opposite effect. The action was raised above, and that's why we have these 3 steps here. That doesn't seem like very far above, but you could put 12 steps there if you wanted to. There's no reason to limit the number of steps. The action is raised up, and it goes all the way to the far eastern part of the church, which we call the apse, where we have a high place, and there's a throne, right? So the central action of a church is raised above the people. And interestingly, when we serve the divine liturgy, the priest is not facing in the direction of what we're doing right now. What we're doing right now is a didactic exercise. So I am facing you, and I'm speaking so that you can hear me. But when I'm at the altar, I'm facing with you, right?
not against you, but with you. And that means that someone else is meant to hear what's happening, not just what the priest is offering, but what we are offering. And this is absolutely key then for us to understand the difference between a liturgical space and a theatrical space or an athletic space. Theatrics and athletics, the people are the focus. In liturgics, God is the focus. He is the one who is seated at the throne. He is the one who is in the high place. It is his sight of us that matters. It is his hearing of our prayers that matters, right? It is time for the Lord to act. That is what we say right at the beginning of the liturgy. You have to listen, right? Because Father Deacon Michael will say that while the hours are still being chanted, and we're sort of doing some prayers up there. Again, another example of what we call liturgical overlap. We're saying some sort of devotional prayers at the altar while the reader is still finishing up the hours and the people are praying. But if you hear those words, it is time for the Lord to act, right? The primary focus in liturgy is that the Lord is coming down and acting within us and amongst us and on our behalf. The primary focus is not what we are doing, but what he is doing. Now, of course, both count. I'm not suggesting that we're passive in the act of worship. All are called to be active. All are called, in fact, to have a priestly ministry towards the Lord. But the orientation is clear. We are all facing the Lord together. We are all making sure that and here again, the acoustics of churches are not designed for the voice of the priest to go out to the people. The acoustics of churches are designed so that the voice of the people rise up to God, right? It's the same image of the incense. The incense is rising as an image of prayer. Well, where is our prayer going? It's rising as well, right? The prayer isn't rising to the people in the stands. The prayer is rising to God. So God is the one who counts in liturgy. God is the one who is our focus. God is the object of our worship, right? And the subject of our worship. Everything flows and everything goes towards him. So that's really important because it lets us know that we are here not to receive something per se, but to give. Thine own of thine own we offer unto thee on behalf of all and for all, right? We are all priests by virtue of our baptism, and we are all here to make an offering, and we are all facing God together, and God is above us, we are below, and everything is rising towards him. So that's one particular orientation. Does anyone have any questions about that? That might seem obvious, but yes. Exactly. Thank you, John. Yeah. So let's talk about one of the things I mentioned last week is that the liturgical scholars of the revival, the liturgical revival, predominantly Roman Catholic, Byzantine Catholic, Anglican, and some prominent Lutherans as well. They identified largely in the 20th century the inaudible prayers of the priest, which were also done, I mentioned, in the West as well, not just in our Orthodox tradition, but in the West. Remember we talked about the Sanctus bells on the altar. That's because you didn't hear the transformation of the gifts, so they rang the bells to let you know that it just happened, because you didn't hear it and you didn't see it. Because even in the West, the Roman Catholic priest was also facing in the same direction as the people, okay? So you didn't see what he was doing on the altar, and he was above you, and there's a long chancel and a rood screen, and you didn't hear it. So all these things, these sort of auditory and visual blockages, if you will, the odd nature of liturgy, they were all identified as being mysteriological, and they were all grouped into one thing. And so they emphasized, for the Orthodox in particular, that the iconostasis, the closing of the doors, the closing of curtains, the inaudible prayers, infrequent communion, which we'll probably talk about infrequent communion because it's related, just in some way it's related to the same time period that we're talking about. All those were lumped into one thing. And as John just asked, yes, in the Roman Catholic Church, they kind of wiped all that away. But not just in the Roman Catholic Church. This was part of a larger liturgical movement in the Episcopal Church as well, the Anglo-Catholic tradition. This was very true. And what it literally meant
was that, number one, they decided, look, the people need to be able to see what's happening up there. So in Western churches, the altar was actually all the way up against the apse. It was against the wall. It didn't stand free form out in the middle. It was against the wall. So you couldn't go behind it and face west. So what they did was they moved them out. And in the church that I grew up in, Church of the Nativity over in Crafton, on the west end of town. That's literally what they did. They moved the altar away from the wall just enough so that the priest could kind of scooch behind it. It was never very dramatic movement, but he could get back there. And so what was the purpose of that? So that the priest would face west. So it was a little bit more like the Last Supper at this point, right? Here's the people gathered. Here's the head of the table. And he's doing something, and we are all watching and seeing what he's doing. So that became very prominent in the Western tradition, was making sure that the people could see and making sure that the people could hear. In that measure, too, a lot of modern post-Vatican II Roman Catholic churches, guess how they're oriented. The action is below, and the people are above it. Right? They have essentially built the opposite of the ancient church. Instead of the action being high and the people being here, rising up to God, they have a slanted floor so that the people have a better visual and auditory experience of what's happening at the altar. And this is where also rood screens. I mean, the Protestants got rid of the rood. The word rood means cross, and so it was somewhat analogous to an iconostasis. This wall that we have, not exactly though. But the idea of the rood screen is that it functioned in the same way. You couldn't really see what was going on back there. So the Protestants got rid of the rood screen a long time ago, and there's a general sense of we need to open all of this up. Right? Is there something else you wanted to mention about that? Yeah. Yes, exactly, with Vatican II. They did, and it's this is where there's a lot of convergence, you see, because the scholars of the liturgical revival that I'm talking about, like Taft and Gregory Dix, what they determined was that these were clericalized problems. All of this element of the inaudible prayers, of the people not being able to see the altar and the action on the altar, they were all considered negative developments. And so we needed to correct the church. And so that's where that happened. What's interesting is we've been very selective in the Orthodox Church, haven't we? We have made some of the prayers more audible, but not all the prayers. We still do a lot of priestly prayers very quietly at the altar during a number of litanies and everything else. But certain things we've made more audible, but we've made no effort to get rid of the iconostasis, other than the fact that some have tried to make more open iconostases, more of a lattice work where you can kind of see back there. And it just, I think in defense of that practice, as Americans, it just makes us more comfortable. Okay? We kind of are suspicious of things happening behind closed doors. Oh, what are they doing back there? Why can't I see? Are they blocking me? I mean, as Americans, we just aren't comfortable with that idea of why can't I see what's going on? And there's certainly nothing. Again, this is not about right or wrong as far as our Orthodox practices. There's nothing wrong with developing an iconostasis that's quite open, and so that you have a kind of visual sense of what's going on back there. It just makes us more comfortable. In fact, and this is another really important thing to say. I mean, I certainly have served Divine Liturgy for mission stations in Texas where there was no iconostasis at all. There were just two icon stands, basically two of these, one with an icon of Christ, one with an icon of Theotokos, sort of sitting right up there, that formed the iconostasis, the royal doors, these doors. There was no curtain, and everything else was completely open. And the thing is, when there's an antimens, how many know what an antimens is? Have you heard that term before? All right, so sort of antimens is one of the minimal things that you need to serve a divine liturgy validly or properly. Antimens is this cloth that sits on the altar that we unfold during the litany after the gospel and the homily. And you'll notice that action. You can kind of see, I'm up there and I kind of do this motion, and there's something on the altar that we're unfolding. All right, that's an antimens. It's an icon of the entombment of Christ on a cloth with relics of a saint sewn into the cloth itself. And literally the bishop has signed it. All right, his autograph is up there, right? And this is a very, very ancient practice. This goes back all the way to the origin of where originally a priest was also a bishop. All right, there were presbyters and bishops, but only bishops were served the liturgy. And it was only after, historically speaking, the church grew to a point where they had to decide we're either going to have like bishops in every community, or we're going to, in a sense, deputize the presbyters to serve the liturgy, and especially to go out into the countryside and serve where there's fewer people. This is how presbyters became priests of the altar. Right? Before then, they were more like elders. In order for a presbyter to serve the divine liturgy, you needed the antimens. Okay, the bishop gave you this cloth. This goes all the way back to like the 3rd, maybe even the 2nd century. The bishop would sign this thing, and that meant you were under his omophore, you were under his authority, and that you could validly serve the divine liturgy. All right. So, as long as there's an antimens, you don't have to have an iconostasis for it to be valid. That is no less a divine liturgy than a divine liturgy in a grand temple like ours. So all of these things, we have to keep that in mind. None of them make the liturgy what it is. And that is precisely the point. It is the Lord and his presence that makes the liturgy what it is, right? That's the main focus. And that's why we face east together. That's why the action is raised and it's behind this wall. And even if it wasn't, I'm wearing this huge phalonion, and so you still can't really see what I'm doing. But here's the point about all of that, and this is where auditory prayers and visual sightlines come into play. Again, remember the theater or the spectacle, the gladiator games. You want to see and hear. We make no effort for everyone to see what's happening. Why? Because what is happening on the altar cannot be seen with your physical eyes. That's what's so important for us to remember. What is happening on the altar cannot be seen with our physical eyes. There is a transformation that occurs, and with your physical eyes, you will never see that happen. And I will never see that happen, not with my physical eyes. The very fact that it's happening behind, like I'm this way, right, and you can't see what's happening, the very fact of that is because the church is calling us to see it using a different organ of perception, the heart, the nous, right? That's where we're heading here for the next stage of the rule of prayer. How do we begin to see with not our eyes, but with our heart, okay? And this is what St. Sophrony means. Let me read a real brief passage from St. Sophrony, because this is, how many of you have heard? St. Sophrony of Essex, England. There's a very famous Orthodox monastery in Essex. St. Sophrony was on Mount Athos. He was a disciple of St. Silouan, the Athonite. And let me see where I have this here. Nope, I have to look at my notes here. This is very simple, but it's helpful when saints write things like this. Through the divine act, and again, we're talking about seeing a divine act, I learned to contemplate the life of Christ-man. Before saying to the apostles, "Take, eat, this is my body," he had prayed in secret to the Father. He did not utter these fearful words as Master, but as the Son of Man, teaching us not to allow a single impulse within us that might have a trace of self-divinization. what I'm drawing from that is this idea that at the Last Supper, the disciples are gathered around the table, and I mentioned this last week, but Jesus offers the prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer of blessing. We assume we know what that means because it must be a Passover meal, it must be a Seder, except that Jesus doesn't pass out blessed bread and wine. He takes the bread and he says, "Take, eat, this is my body." My goodness. That does not belong in a Seder meal. Okay? That is not what you say at a Seder meal. So what did he pray before he said that? St. Sophrony is saying that prayer was inscrutable. The disciples didn't hear it. They didn't perceive with their auditory ears or eyes the prayer that preceded, "Take, eat, this is my body." Because that is not something that we can perceive except by the Holy Spirit and as a gift of grace. It's not a function of ears and eyes. It's a function of the heart, of spiritual perception, okay? And interestingly, let me read another quick passage. Here's a very fascinating book. And please, if I recommend a book, before you run out and buy it, because I had this problem, and sometimes in Charleston, I felt like every time I mentioned a book, people were writing it down and ordering on Amazon while I was still talking. I'm not necessarily recommending this book. Some of you would find this book probably pretty boring. It's called The Ancient City. It was written in the late 1800s by this man, and I never studied French, so forgive me if I butcher his name, Numa Denis Fustel de Calange. It was a French classicist, and The Ancient City is a book that his basic premise, and he exhaustively quotes all ancient Greek and Roman writers and carries over his research into the Etruscans, but also all the way out to the Indians, the Hindus in India, because there's a lot sort of uniting those cultures. And I have to mention this too, because we're online and who knows who's watching. There's some problems in this. There's some ethnographic problems in this book. All right, he talks about the Aryan race and that sort of thing. That was a kind of common way of speaking of the ethnic origins of Europeans back in the 19th century, okay? So this is where I caution on books like this. The value of this book is the degree to which he demonstrates how worship was the origin of the family, the tribe, the city, and then later the empire. In other words, which is a short way of saying, we don't understand the ancients at all. Because we tend to very anachronistically understand previous eras in the same light of ours. So when we say family, what does that mean? Mom and dad, 2 kids and a dog. That's what a family is. The nuclear family. That was not what a family was in the ancient world at all. A family was gathered around the concept of the worship of ancestors. And the worship of ancestors, just very briefly here, because I find this so fascinating. Ancient peoples believed that when their family members died, they became deified. They essentially became gods. In a sense, it's almost like what we mean when we say ghosts, right? And when we make movies about ghosts, we give the ghosts power, right? The ghost can scare us. The ghost can move things. The ghosts can kill us. The ghosts can terrify us, right? That's what they mean by deification in a lot of ways. And one of the sacred things to the Etruscans, to the Romans, to the Greeks, was to bury your ancestors properly. And the whole origin of private property in the ancient world was where your families members were buried, because they believed, one, that something survived death, that you didn't just die altogether, but two, you always remain connected to your body. So they believed that their ancestors, when they were buried, were living in that burial spot, okay? So when you look at the ancient barrows, right, burial mounds of the ancient world, they're creating specific, they don't just toss the body into the creek and say, oh, well, drink from upstream. They don't treat the body as, oh, he's dead and gone and the body doesn't matter anymore. They actually treated the body sacredly in what, ironically, we call pagan Greece and Rome.
They would call pagans the people who didn't do these things, right? The pagans lived beyond the Danube, beyond the Rhine. The Pagani, those were the pagans. They were religious people before Christ, before, they weren't Jews. These were ancient Greeks, Romans, Etruscans, etc. They were religious people because they worshiped their ancestors. And the keeping of the worship of the ancestors was the sacred duty of the head of each household, which was always a man, but always because the man was the keeper of worship, and only his son could inherit it or someone else that took his son's place at worship. This is why slaves could become heirs within families, because slaves were introduced into the family worship. And there are a lot of aspects about that worship, and we could do a whole course. This is such a fascinating book, but we could do a whole course on this. But the bottom line is that a lot of this worship was considered secret. And let me just read a couple things. This is actually later. I'm talking about the family, but now we're going a little bit more into the cities. The use of sacred books was universal among the Greeks, the Romans, and the Etruscans. Sometimes the ritual was written on tablets of wood, sometimes on cloth. Athens engraved its rites upon tablets of copper that they might be imperishable. Rome had its books of the pontiffs, right? Interesting word. We think of the supreme pontiff as the Pope of Rome, right? The Roman Catholic Pope of Rome. But the word pontiff actually predates Christianity in the Roman practices and refers to basically the heads of worship in the city of Rome. Rome had its books of the pontiffs, its books of the augurs, its book of ceremonies, and its collection of indigitamenta, or lists of deities. There was not a city which had not also its collection of ancient hymns in honor of its gods. In vain did language change with manners and beliefs. The words and the rhythm of worship remained unchangeable. And on the festivals, men continued to sing these hymns long after they understood them. Isn't that interesting? For those of you old enough to remember the church here celebrating in Slavonic, right? Long after we were able to understand what was happening, we refused to change our language. That goes so far back. That's not just an Orthodox ethnic thing. That goes all the way back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks, and Etruscans. The belief that worship should never change, even if everything else does. Let's see. These books and songs written by the priests were preserved by them with the greatest care. Now here's the real kicker. They were never revealed to strangers. Worship was always private. Only the exact members would gain admittance. And this went from the family worship of ancestors to the city worship to empire worship. It was private. It was not, strangers were not permitted. And by the way, that was also universal amongst Christianity as well, at least when it came to communion. When we think of communion in the Orthodox Church, we're really about the last ones who insist that you must be Orthodox and prepared to receive communion. But up until 1950, do you know all Protestants did the same thing? If you visited a Presbyterian church, and they would say, well, who are you? Well, I'm an Orthodox Christian. Oh, you're Christian? Well, you can receive communion, right? That's what we assume. But not up until about 1950 was that true. You went to a Presbyterian church, communion was only for the members of that church. It was not for visitors. You were not admitted, all right? Again, we're holding on to practices that go deep into prehistory. They were never revealed to strangers. To reveal a rite or a formula would have been to betray the religion of the city and to deliver its gods to the enemy. For greater precaution, they were concealed from the citizens themselves, and the priests alone were allowed to know them. Isn't that an interesting statement in the context of the inaudible prayers? Now, the temptation is to think, oh, well, that's why we did that. We're just pagans, okay? We're just copying the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that's why some of these prayers, like the prayers of light, we don't do those out loud because the citizens aren't allowed to know. No, that would be an incorrect thing. The impulse that religion is for believers, the impulse that liturgy, I should say, more specifically, is for the believers, that worship is for those who are participants. That, of course, goes all the way back. But what's interesting in Fustel, what's his name? Dennis. I'll call him Dennis because I don't know. Dr. Dennis. I don't know. Is his first name Numa? Is that a first name? It's an ancient Roman name, Numa, but I'm going to call him Dr. Dennis. Dr. Dennis emphasizes this, that, now I lost my train of thought thinking about Dr. Dennis. The reason why they kept these prayers secret is because what they thought the prayers were doing. And this will be we have to end on this today. There's never enough time to cover this stuff, but they thought that when you prayed, you were essentially appeasing the gods. This is why you fed your ancestors, by the way. Again, something else that many Orthodox Christians do on Radonitsa, right? We take food and we leave it on the graves. The ancient Romans and Greeks and Etruscans did that. Why did they do that? They did that and they prayed because they believed that their prayers would ensure that the gods would favor them. They were essentially propitiatory prayers, prayers that made the gods favorable to them, because otherwise the gods were fickle. And to the ancients, before Christianity, you could never really trust the gods. Your prayers had to be exact, because if you messed it up, the gods would abandon you and you would be destroyed, right? They lived in constant fear of that. So they were religious people, but they were religious people towards gods that were not loving, that were not trustworthy, that were incredibly fickle. They were hungry all the time. You had to feed them and you had to get everything right or they were going to kill you, all right? And you had to keep this secret so that the citizens couldn't mess this up and anger the gods, you see. And that has nothing to do with what we're doing in the Christian church. That has nothing to do with what we're doing in the Orthodox church. We'll continue along this line of thinking, but this is how deep this stuff runs. And when we think about that in the ancient world, that prayers were secret, religion was not revealed to strangers, how does that morph and how does that transform when we get into the open Christian gospel, where we look at the prayers that the priests do? And this will be my final thought, and then we have to end. And it's very clear that there's nothing in our prayers that's secretive, right? And this is why many people say this is why we should do them out loud. Read the Anaphra Prayers. That's just part of the public, what we call the Kerygma, the proclamation of the gospel. There's no secret information there. There's no secret knowledge. We're not hiding anything. We're doing something else. But that has to do more with this other aspect of why we build our churches the way we do and what it means to enter the mystery of the presence of God, and for all of us as priests to be both praising and worshiping Him and offering prayers that rise up to Him all at the same time in this overlapping way. So keep all that, put it in the vault, remember it. Next week we'll continue along this train of thought, but we're going to talk a little bit more specifically and biblically about what we're doing at the altar and how we all participate, so that we can begin to understand this next dimension of the rule of prayer, which is prayer of the heart. Okay, thank you, and we'll begin the hours here in just a moment.